Throughout history, there have been men whose reputations were written not in newspaper headlines or history books, but in the hushed whispers of those who knew better than to speak their names too loudly. In the competitive shooting circuits of the 1980s, few names carried more weight than Marcus Lightning Cooper, a man who could put 6 rounds through the same hole at 50 yards and whose speed with a pistol seemed to defy the laws of physics itself. They say he once won the national championship with a borrowed gun, shooting perfect scores while giving his competitors a 3-second handicap. But in 1989, Cooper vanished from the competition scene as suddenly as a gunshot's echo fades in the wind, leaving behind only speculation and legend. Some said he'd been recruited by a secretive government agency. Others claimed he'd grown tired of the spotlight. But the truth, as it often does, lay buried deeper than most cared to dig. Join me today as we uncover the story of a man who thought he'd left his past behind, only to discover that some skills, once learned, become as much a part of you as your own heartbeat. If you're enjoying these tales of hidden legends, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's story might just change everything you thought you knew about America's forgotten heroes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Millbrook, Oregon, present day. The town sat like a forgotten comma in the manuscript of America's Pacific Northwest, a place where the endless green of Douglas firs met the gray monotony of rain-worn buildings. It was the kind of town people usually drove through on their way to somewhere else, barely registering its existence beyond the blur of their windshield wipers. The Pine Grove Diner stood as its unofficial landmark, its neon sign casting a watery glow through the perpetual mist that seemed to blanket the town 10 months out of the year. Sarah Chen had owned the diner for 15 years, inheriting it from her father, who'd bought it back when Millbrook still thought it had a future in lumber. She'd seen every type of customer the highway could deliver, from truckers to tourists to troubled souls seeking anonymity in small-town shadows. But something about the man who walked in that rainy Tuesday morning in March caught her attention in a way she couldn't quite explain. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with the lean build of someone who'd spent a lifetime keeping himself in shape without making a show of it. Silver threaded his dark hair at the temples, and he moved with the kind of fluid grace that made even the simple act of sliding onto a counterstool seem deliberate and precise. But it was his eyes that held Sarah's attention, gray as the Oregon sky outside, alert yet distant, like someone who'd trained themselves to see everything while revealing nothing. "Coffee black," he said softly, his voice barely carrying over the quiet murmur of the morning regulars. "And whatever's warm." The way he positioned himself, back to the wall, clear view of both exits, might have gone unnoticed by most, but Sarah had spent too many years reading people across her counter to miss such details. "Got fresh chicken pot pie," she offered, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Best cure for a day like this." He nodded, those gray eyes scanning the diner in what seemed like casual glances, but somehow managed to catalog every patron, every movement. In the corner booth, 3 local men watched the newcomer with the territorial interest of small-town bullies, who'd never quite outgrown their high school habits. Daryl Tucker, former high school football star turned unsuccessful real estate agent, leaned forward to whisper something to his companions that made them snicker. They'd been getting bolder lately, testing boundaries, making trouble with outsiders who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. What happened next would later be pieced together from half a dozen different perspectives, each witness adding their own color to what would become a local legend. Daryl, emboldened by his audience and 3 morning beers, decided to make an example of the quiet stranger. He shouldn't have. Some dogs are better left sleeping, some shadows better left unexplored. But men like Daryl Tucker never learned that lesson until it was too late, and the quiet man at the counter was about to become Millbrook's most interesting story in decades. Daryl Tucker had spent his entire life in Millbrook, and like many small-town bullies, he'd learned to mistake familiarity for authority. He stood up from his booth, all 6'3" of former high school glory gone slightly soft around the edges, and made his way to the counter. His friends, Mike Cassidy and Pete Reeves, exchanged knowing grins, already anticipating their morning entertainment. "Seats taken," Darrell announced, standing uncomfortably close to the quiet stranger. The man continued eating his pot pie, each movement measured and precise as if Darrell's words were nothing more than distant traffic noise. Sarah Chen felt the atmosphere in the diner shift, like the air pressure change before a storm. She'd seen Darrell pull this routine before, but something felt different this time. "Did you hear me, old-timer?" Darrell pressed, his voice carrying that edge of manufactured menace that bullies cultivate. "Said that seats taken. We got rules here in Millbrook about where strangers can sit." The stranger set his fork down with deliberate care, the movement so controlled it seemed almost surgical. When he spoke, his voice remained as soft as before, but somehow it carried to every corner of the suddenly silent diner. "The seat's attached to the floor, son, and I'm not quite finished with my pie." A few of the regulars shifted uncomfortably. Nobody talked to Darrell Tucker that way, not since he'd put Tom Henderson in the hospital over a parking space dispute. But the stranger's calm seemed to fill the space around him, as solid and immovable as the granite countertop he was eating from. "You've got a smart mouth for someone who doesn't know the lay of the land," Darrell growled, his face reddening. He reached out to grab the stranger's shoulder, a move that had intimidated countless others before. What happened next occurred so quickly that witnesses would later disagree on the exact sequence of events. The stranger's hand moved in a blur, catching Darrell's wrist 2 inches from his shoulder. His grip looked almost gentle, but Darrell's face went white with pain. "3 things you should know," the stranger said, his voice still conversational, almost friendly. "First, that grip you're feeling? It's hitting a pressure point that can cause permanent nerve damage if held for more than 30 seconds. Second, I've spent the last 20 minutes watching you and your friends in the reflection of that napkin holder, so I knew exactly what was coming. And third—" He paused, those gray eyes finally meeting Darrell's. "I really hate leaving a good meal unfinished." He released Darrell's wrist with the same fluid precision he'd grabbed it with. Darrell stumbled back, rubbing his arm, his face a mix of shock and wounded pride. Mike and Pete had half risen from their booth, uncertain whether to intervene. Sarah Chen, watching from behind the counter, noticed something that others missed. When the stranger had moved, his jacket had shifted slightly, revealing what looked like the grip of a competition-grade pistol in a custom holster. More telling was the way he'd immediately adjusted his posture after the movement, settling back into a position that kept the weapon concealed while maintaining perfect access. "You're going to regret this," Darrell snarled, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "You don't know who you're messing with." The stranger turned back to his pie, his voice dropping so low that only Darrell and Sarah could hear it. "Son, I've forgotten more about messing with people than you'll ever know. Now, why don't you go back to your friends and let me enjoy the rest of my breakfast in peace?" As Darrell retreated to his booth, Sarah noticed the stranger's hand had never strayed toward his concealed weapon. He hadn't needed it. The way he had moved, the absolute control in every action, spoke of capabilities far beyond what a simple shooting competition background might suggest. And as she refilled his coffee cup, she couldn't shake the feeling that Millbrook's quiet morning was about to become considerably more interesting. Word travels fast in small towns, carried on whispers and text messages, growing with each retelling. By early afternoon, the story of the stranger's encounter with Darrell Tucker had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. At the local hardware store, Jack Wilson, the owner and unofficial town historian, found himself fielding questions from curious locals. "Something about him seems familiar," Jack mused, sorting through decades-old shooting magazines he kept in his back office. "Could have sworn I've seen his face before, maybe 20, 30 years back." He pulled out a yellowed issue from 1988, its cover featuring a younger version of the stranger holding a custom competition pistol. The headline reading, "Cooper, does it again, perfect score sets new record." Meanwhile, at the Pine Grove Diner, Sarah Chen was dealing with an unusual surge of customers, all seemingly fascinated by the empty counter stool where the morning's events had unfolded. The stranger had left shortly after finishing his pie, paying in cash and leaving a generous tip, but his presence seemed to linger like smoke in still air. "Never seen anything like it," Tom Henderson commented from his usual booth, his arm still in a sling from his own encounter with Daryl months ago. "Way he moved reminded me of my time in the service. Had an instructor once, ex-Special Forces, had the same kind of, efficiency." Outside, the Oregon rain continued its steady rhythm, but it couldn't wash away the tension building in Millbrook streets. Daryl Tucker had spent the afternoon at the Rusty Nail, the town's only bar, nursing both his wounded pride and several whiskeys. Mike Cassidy and Pete Reeves sat with him, their usual bravado subdued by the morning's events. "Called my cousin in Portland," Pete said, lowering his voice. "He's a gun nut. Follows all that competitive shooting stuff. Says there was this guy back in the 80s, Marcus Cooper. They called him Lightning. Never missed, never lost. Then one day he just disappeared. Some say he went to work for some secret government outfit training their shooters." Daryl's face darkened at the mention of the stranger's possible identity. "Don't care who he was. This is my town. Nobody makes me look bad in my town." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts before finding the one he wanted. "Remember my brother's friend from Spokane? The one who does special jobs?" Mike shifted uncomfortably. "Come on, Daryl. Maybe we should let this one go." Guy was just passing through. But he could tell from Daryl's expression that letting it go wasn't an option. Pride, especially wounded pride in a small town, could be more dangerous than any weapon. At the small motel on the edge of town, Marcus Cooper, if that was indeed his name, sat cleaning a custom Wilson Combat 1911 with practiced precision. Each part was inspected, cleaned, and reassembled with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of decades of experience. On the bed beside him lay an open newspaper, its headline announcing another shooting competition victory, dated 1989, just before he disappeared from the circuit. The motel room's layout had been subtly rearranged since he'd checked in. The chair was positioned for a clear view of both the door and window, the bed moved slightly to provide cover if needed. Old habits, carved into muscle memory by years of experience that went far beyond competition shooting. Sarah Chen, closing up the diner for the afternoon shift change, watched the rain paint patterns on her windows and thought about the stranger's eyes. She'd seen something in them, something that went deeper than just skilled hands and quick reflexes. It was the look of someone who'd seen the darker side of life and learned to navigate it. Someone who knew that real violence didn't announce itself with tough talk and posturing. As evening settled over Millbrook, Sheriff David Martinez sat in his office reviewing a file that hadn't seen daylight in years. The manila folder, edges worn and faded, contained newspaper clippings and official reports about a series of incidents from the early 1990s. Each article detailed precision shooting exhibitions at highly secure facilities, demonstrations that went far beyond typical competition skills. "You're sure it's him?" He spoke into his phone, eyes fixed on a grainy photograph. The voice on the other end belonged to an old friend at the FBI's Portland office. "Yeah, same guy. Marcus Cooper. After he left the competition circuit, he spent 5 years training federal agents in advanced marksmanship. Then something happened, something classified. He dropped off the grid completely." The sheriff's gaze drifted to his window, where the rain-slicked streets reflected the neon signs of local businesses. "Should I be concerned?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Only if someone's stupid enough to push him," came the reply. "He's not a threat unless threatened. But Dave, if it goes bad, it'll go bad fast." At the Rusty Nail, Daryl Tucker's plans were taking shape. His brother's friend from Spokane, a man known only as Jensen, had arrived an hour ago. Jensen was everything Cooper wasn't: loud, obvious, with the kind of swagger that announced potential violence like a rattlesnake's warning. He sat at the bar now, cleaning his nails with a hunting knife, making sure everyone noticed the gesture. Simple enough job, Jensen was saying, his voice just loud enough to carry to nearby tables. Your boy Cooper's got a reputation, sure, but everybody bleeds. Sometimes the legends need reminding they're just men. He pocketed his knife with a flourish. Course, reputation like his comes with a price tag to match. Darryl swallowed hard, then pushed an envelope across the bar. It's all there. Just make sure it looks like he started it. Like self-defense. Jensen's smile never reached his eyes as he pocketed the envelope. Don't worry about the details, that's what you're paying for. Back at the Pine Grove Diner, Sarah Chen was preparing to close for the night when Jack Wilson hurried in, clutching his old magazines. Sarah, you need to see this. He spread the publications across the counter, each featuring Cooper in his competition days. Look at the dates. Look at the scores. Nobody's ever shot like this before or since, but it's what happened after that's interesting. He pointed to the last article, dated 1989. This was his final competition. Perfect score, as usual. But look at who's in the background. The photo showed military and government officials watching from behind the firing line. Next week he vanished. No announcements, no retirement speech. Just gone. Sarah studied the photos, noting how even then, Cooper's eyes held that same distant alertness she'd seen this morning. What happened to him, Jack? Where did he go? That's the thing. Jack lowered his voice, despite the empty diner. I've got a buddy, ex-military, says Cooper didn't just train agents. Story goes, he was part of something bigger, something they don't talk about in official channels. Outside, Jensen was walking the streets of Millbrook, getting a feel for the terrain. He passed Cooper's motel, noting the room number and sightlines. In the rain-streaked window, he caught a glimpse of movement. Cooper methodically field-stripping another weapon, his movements as precise as a surgeon's. For a moment, Jensen hesitated. He'd heard the stories, knew the reputation. But pride and money were powerful motivators, and he'd built his own reputation on taking jobs others wouldn't touch. Besides, he reasoned, everyone slows down with age. Even legends. In his motel room, Cooper watched Jensen's reflection in his window and allowed himself a small sigh. He'd recognized the type immediately, a hired gun trying to play in a league he didn't understand. The real question was whether the young man would be smart enough to walk away, or if Millbrook was about to learn exactly why some reputations were built on more than just stories. The next morning brought a change in Millbrook's weather, the constant rain finally giving way to a heavy mist that clung to the streets like forgotten memories. Sarah Chen arrived early to open the diner, her mind still processing Jack Wilson's revelations about their mysterious visitor. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 6:15 a.m., and she wasn't surprised to see Cooper walking in, taking the same seat as yesterday. Figured you might have moved on by now, she said, already pouring his coffee. A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he watched the steam rise from the cup. Not quite yet. Got some business to finish. His eyes moved to the window, tracking Jensen's reflection as the hired gun walked past the diner for the third time that morning. Sheriff Martinez chose that moment to enter, the bell's chime somehow more official when accompanying his uniform. He settled onto the stool next to Cooper, leaving one seat between them, close enough for conversation, far enough for comfort. Mr. Cooper, he said quietly, got an interesting call from Portland yesterday. Cooper sipped his coffee, his expression unchanging. David Martinez, he replied, surprising the sheriff with the use of his first name. Class of 92, FBI Advanced Marksmanship Program. You were good with a rifle, if I remember correctly. Martinez felt a chill run down his spine. He'd never mentioned his training to anyone in Millbrook. Got a situation developing, Martinez continued, recovering his composure. Man named Jensen checked into the Mountain View Motel last night. Has an interesting record of solving other people's problems permanently. He paused, studying Cooper's reflection in the chrome napkin holder. Any thoughts on that? Might have a few, Cooper answered, his voice soft but carrying an edge like a well-honed blade. Question is, Sheriff, are you here to prevent something or to witness it? The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sarah, pretending to wipe down the counter nearby, noticed how both men seemed to track every movement in the diner without appearing to look around. It was like watching two wolves sizing each other up while pretending to be sheep. "Town's been peaceful," Martinez said finally. "Like to keep it that way." Cooper nodded slightly. "Peace is good, but peace built on bullies and fear isn't peace at all. Sometimes the ground needs clearing before anything healthy can grow." He placed his cup down with precision that spoke of years of muscle memory. "Your FBI friends tell you what I did after the training program?" Martinez shook his head. "Above my clearance level, but they said if trouble starts, stay out of your way and keep civilians clear." A genuine smile crossed Cooper's face, brief as lightning. Smart friends. He stood, leaving money for his coffee. Might want to talk to Daryl Tucker about his recent financial transactions. Sometimes preventing something is better than witnessing it. As Cooper walked out, Sarah noticed he moved differently than yesterday. More fluid, more focused, like a shift in barometric pressure before a storm. Martinez must have noticed too, because he immediately pulled out his phone and started making calls. Outside, Jensen watched Cooper walk down the street, his hand unconsciously touching the gun hidden under his jacket. He'd spent the morning studying his target, and something felt off. The way Cooper moved. The way he constantly maintained awareness of his surroundings without seeming to. It all added up to something Jensen was beginning to wish he'd considered before taking Daryl's money. In his office, Jack Wilson was on the phone with his military contact. "You don't understand," he was saying. "Jensen's here, in Millbrook. You need to tell me what really happened in '94, what Cooper did in that classified operation." The answer made him sink into his chair, face pale. "Mother of God," he whispered. "And Jensen's going up against that?" The mist continued to curl through Millbrook's streets, but now it felt less like nature's afterthought and more like a shroud waiting to cover whatever was coming. Cooper had been right. Sometimes the ground needs clearing. But first, blood has to be spilled. By mid-morning, the mist had retreated to the surrounding hills, leaving Millbrook's streets unusually bright and exposed. Daryl Tucker paced nervously in the back room of the Rusty Nail, watching Jensen clean his weapons with mechanical precision. Each click and snap of metal against metal seemed to echo his growing anxiety. "Should have happened by now," Daryl muttered, checking his phone for the 10th time in as many minutes. "You said it'd be quick, clean." Jensen didn't look up from his work, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Had to change the plan. Your boy Cooper, he's not what you said he was. This needs special handling." In the sheriff's office, Martinez was studying a file that had just arrived from his FBI contact. Most of it was heavily redacted, but certain phrases stood out like neon signs: unprecedented accuracy under extreme combat conditions, and successful elimination of all hostile elements there is see. Sunder, Gerarder, Stander Arsamend. Read door 1994, and the location was completely blacked out. "Jesus," Martinez whispered, reading between the redacted lines. He wasn't just training them. He reached for his phone, but before he could dial, Sarah Chen burst into his office, her face tight with worry. "Sheriff, you need to see this." She held up her phone, showing a text from one of her regular customers. Mike Cassidy just told his girlfriend that Daryl hired someone to handle Cooper. Said it's happening today. Martinez was already reaching for his gun belt when his office phone rang. The caller ID showed Jack Wilson's number. "Dave," Jack's voice was urgent. "My military contact finally opened up about Cooper. That classified operation in '94? It wasn't training. They sent him in alone against a compound full of armed terrorists. He walked out 40 minutes later. Nobody else walked out at all." At the Mountain View Motel, Cooper sat in his room, methodically preparing for what was coming. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as he checked and rechecked his equipment. On the bed lay 3 guns, his Competition 1911, a compact backup piece, and something else, something that hadn't seen daylight in years. The latter was a custom-built weapon that looked nothing like the competition pistols he was famous for. The motel room phone rang once, then stopped. Cooper nodded slightly to himself, the signal he'd been waiting for. In the parking lot, Tom Henderson sat in his truck, hand still on the phone. He owed Cooper for this morning, when the quiet stranger had helped change his flat tire, showing him a way to manage it one-handed despite his injured arm. The least he could do was watch the motel and make that call if Jensen showed up. Jensen himself was moving through the back alleys of Millbrook, checking angles and positions. Something about this job felt wrong, like trying to trap a ghost with mundane weapons. He'd done his homework after that morning's observation, made some calls, called in some favors. What he'd learned made him seriously consider walking away, money be damned. In the Rusty Nail, Daryl's phone buzzed with a text from Pete. "Cooper's still at motel. Alone." Daryl forwarded the message to Jensen, adding, "Now's your chance." Jensen read the message and allowed himself a grim smile. Amateur move, creating electronic evidence of conspiracy. Sarah Chen stood at her diner window watching the unusually empty street. The locals knew something was coming. They could feel it in the air, like the charged atmosphere before a lightning strike. She thought about Cooper's eyes when he'd spoken to Martinez that morning. Not the eyes of someone preparing for a fight, but of someone preparing to end one. Martinez made one final call to his FBI contact. "You sure about this? About him?" The answer was brief but clear. "If Cooper's involved, just keep civilians clear and let it play out." "And Dave? If you see him start to move, don't blink. You might miss something historic." The morning crept toward noon, and Millbrook held its breath. Someone was about to learn why some legends are better left unexplored, why some reputations are built on foundations of granite rather than sand. The only question was, how many people would have to witness the lesson firsthand? Noon arrived in Millbrook with unusual stillness, as if the whole town was holding its breath. The lunch rush at the Pine Grove Diner never materialized. Locals seemed to instinctively know to stay home. Sarah Chen stood behind her counter, watching Cooper's reflection in the window as he walked past, heading toward the town's small park. His movements were unhurried, but purposeful, like a man following a carefully rehearsed script. Jensen watched too, from his position in the alley behind the Rusty Nail. He'd set up 3 potential engagement points, each offering different advantages, but Cooper's casual stroll toward the park wasn't part of any scenario he'd planned. The hired gun felt sweat trickle down his spine despite the cool air. 20 years of wet work had taught him to recognize when something wasn't right, and everything about this situation screamed warning. Sheriff Martinez had positioned himself on the second floor of the hardware store, watching through binoculars. Jack Wilson stood beside him, holding printouts of newly arrived documents about Cooper's past. "Look at this," Jack whispered, pointing to a paragraph. After that '94 operation, they classified his marksmanship scores. Not just the recent ones, all of them, going back to his competition days. Like they suddenly realized what those scores really meant. In the park, Cooper settled onto a bench facing the town square. His position seemed random but offered clear lines of sight to all 3 of Jensen's prepared locations. He pulled out a newspaper, opened it to the crossword, and began filling it in with a pen he held with competition shooter's precision. Daryl Tucker watched from the Rusty Nail's window, his face flushed with alcohol and anxiety. "What's he doing?" he hissed into his phone. "Just sitting there making us wait?" Jensen's reply was terse. "He's not making us wait. He's making a point." Mike Cassidy, watching from his parked car, felt his phone buzz. The text from his girlfriend chilled him. "Military contact says Cooper once took out 6 armed men in under 2 seconds. All headshots, FBI classified the video." Mike looked at the seemingly relaxed figure on the park bench and made a decision. He started his car and drove out of town without looking back. Sarah Chen had closed the diner, but remained inside, something telling her she needed to witness what was coming. She saw Jensen move between buildings, trying to approach the park from an oblique angle. Cooper turned a page in his newspaper, his movements so natural they had to be calculated. "It's like watching a chess master," Tom Henderson murmured from his seat in the diner. He'd come in through the back door, drawn by the same instinct that kept Sarah watching. He's already won, and Jensen doesn't even know they're playing. The hired gun was starting to realize it, though. Each time he tried to maneuver into position, he found his planned angle slightly off, blocked by some piece of town architecture he hadn't properly accounted for. Cooper hadn't moved from his bench, but somehow the space around him had become a geometric puzzle with no solution. Martinez's phone buzzed with a text from his FBI contact. "Whatever happens, remember, Cooper doesn't miss. Ever. Not in competition, not in combat, not once in 30 years. The sheriff lowered his binoculars, understanding finally dawning. "He's not waiting for Jensen to make a move," he told Jack. "He's waiting for Jensen to realize he's already lost." In the rusty nail, Daryl's nerve finally broke. He grabbed his phone to call Jensen, to tell him to call it off. But before he could dial, he saw Cooper fold his newspaper with surgical precision. The quiet man stood, stretched casually, and began walking directly toward Jensen's position, as if he'd known exactly where his would-be ambusher was all along. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across Millbrook's streets. Everyone watching knew they were about to witness something that would become part of the town's legend, assuming they could follow it fast enough to actually see what happened. Jensen felt it before he saw it, that subtle shift in the air that combat veterans learn to recognize or die missing. Cooper was walking directly toward his position, hands empty, steps measured, each movement so casual it had to be intentional. The hired gun's instinct screamed at him to move, to act, to do something, but his body seemed frozen in place. From his vantage point, Sheriff Martinez watched through his binoculars as Cooper closed the distance. "My God," he whispered to Jack Wilson. "Look at his footwork." Each step placed Cooper's feet exactly where they needed to be for whatever came next, like a dancer following choreography only he could hear. In the rusty nail, Daryl Tucker's phone clattered to the floor as Pete Reeves burst in through the back door. "Mike's gone," Pete gasped. "Just drove straight out of town. Said something about Cooper's military record." His words cut off as they heard the first exchange outside. "That's far enough." Jensen's voice carried clearly in the still afternoon air as he stepped out from his hiding spot, weapon trained on Cooper. The quiet man stopped, that same ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Two things you should know," Cooper said softly, his voice somehow reaching every watching ear. "First, you're standing exactly where I'd be if I were planning this ambush. Second, that means you're also standing exactly where I planned for you to be." Jensen felt his professional calm crack slightly. Every instinct, every year of experience told him he had the advantage. Weapon drawn, perfect position, clear shot. So why did it feel like he was the one walking into a trap? Sarah Chen, watching from her diner window, saw what happened next with perfect clarity, though later she would struggle to describe it. Cooper's hand moved, not toward his visible holster, but to brush away an imaginary piece of lint from his sleeve. The gesture was so natural, so casual, that it took everyone a moment to realize he now held something that gleamed dully in the afternoon light. "That's a nice Glock 19 you're holding," Cooper continued conversationally as if discussing the weather. "About 30 feet between us. You're probably calculating that at this distance, with your weapon already drawn, there's no way I could—" He let the sentence hang unfinished. Jensen felt sweat trickle down his spine. The weapon in Cooper's hand wasn't his competition pistol. It was something else, something that spoke of black operations and classified missions. "Don't," Jensen warned, but his voice lacked conviction. "You did your homework before taking this job," Cooper said, his tone almost sympathetic. "But you checked my competition records, my known history, the stuff they let people see." His gray eyes locked onto Jensen's. "Did you ever wonder why they classified the rest?" In the hardware store, Jack Wilson's military contact was practically shouting through the phone. "Get everyone back. If Cooper's holding what I think he is, that's the prototype he used in '94. The one they could never replicate." Martinez keyed his radio, ready to order an evacuation, but it was already too late. Cooper's next words seemed to echo through the suddenly silent streets of Millbrook. "Last chance to walk away," he said quietly. "I've got dinner plans, and blood is hell to get out of good clothes." Time seemed to crystallize. Jensen stood frozen, professional instincts warring with survival instinct. His finger tightened fractionally on his trigger. In the rusty nail, Daryl Tucker reached for his phone to call it off. Sarah Chen gripped the edge of her counter, understanding she was about to witness something that would become part of Millbrook's permanent legend. And Cooper just stood there, radiating the kind of absolute calm that comes only from complete certainty. The calm of a man who had already played out every possible scenario and knew exactly how each one would end. What happened next would be debated in Millbrook for years to come, with each witness remembering details differently, as if their eyes couldn't quite process the speed of events. Jensen made his choice, squeezing the trigger with the skill that had made him feared across 3 states. The sound of his Glock shattered the afternoon quiet like breaking glass. But Cooper was no longer there. In the instant between decision and action, between trigger pull and bullet's flight, Cooper had moved. Not diving or rolling like in the movies, but a precise economic shift of position that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Jensen's first shot passed through empty air, as did his second and third, each bullet finding the space Cooper had occupied milliseconds before. "That's one." Cooper's voice came from impossibly close, though no one had seen him cross the distance. The weapon in his hand made a sound unlike anything the witnesses had heard before, not the sharp crack of a normal pistol, but a sound that seemed to bend around corners and slide through shadows. Jensen's gun hand suddenly felt empty, his Glock spinning away into the dust. He hadn't seen Cooper shoot, hadn't even seen him aim. But the precision mark on his weapon's slide showed where Cooper's round had struck, somehow threading the needle between Jensen's fingers without touching flesh. "That's 2, Cooper continued, his voice still conversational. By now he had somehow circled behind Jensen, though no one watching could track exactly how. "The third one's up to you." Sheriff Martinez lowered his binoculars, his hands shaking slightly. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered to Jack Wilson. The reports weren't exaggerated, they were understated. In the hardware store office, Jack's military contact was still shouting through the phone. "What's he using? Is it the prototype? Tell me exactly what you see." Sarah Chen, watching from her diner, noticed something others missed. Throughout the entire exchange, Cooper's breathing never changed. His movements remained measured and calm, as if this deadly dance was just another practice session on a sunny afternoon. Jensen stood frozen, professional pride warring with survival instinct. In 20 years of wet work, he'd never encountered anything like this. His backup piece rested against his ankle, but he knew with bone-deep certainty that reaching for it would be the last mistake he'd ever make. "The thing about reputation," Cooper said softly, now somehow back in front of Jensen without appearing to move, "is that sometimes the stories don't tell the whole truth. The competition circuit, the perfect scores, the speed records, that was just practice. Keeping the skills sharp." His gray eyes seemed to look straight through Jensen. "Want to know what I was practicing for?" From the rusty nail, Daryl Tucker watched in horrified fascination as his expensive plan unraveled. Pete had already slipped out the back door, following Mike's example of quick departure. Through the window, Daryl could see Cooper holding something that didn't look quite like any weapon he'd ever seen. All black angles and custom modifications that spoke of classified projects and unlimited budgets. "Last chance," Cooper offered, his voice carrying clearly across the afternoon air. "Walk away. Take a message back to whoever might be interested. Millbrook's off limits. The ghost of Painted Rock had his territory. This is mine." In that moment, Jensen made the smartest decision of his career. His hands rose slowly, deliberately empty. "Message received," he managed, his voice surprisingly steady. "I'll be checking out of the motel within the hour." Cooper nodded once, the prototype weapon somehow already invisible, though no one saw him holster it. Smart choice. The next demonstration wouldn't have been non-lethal. He turned slightly, raising his voice. "Isn't that right, Daryl?" In the rusty nail, Daryl Tucker's glass slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor like his illusions of control over his small-town kingdom. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's main street, as Jensen's rental car disappeared over the horizon. Cooper hadn't moved from his position, his attention now focused on the rusty nail, where Daryl Tucker remained frozen behind the window. Sheriff Martinez approached carefully, his steps measured and deliberate. "That weapon you used," Martinez said quietly. "I've never seen anything like it." Cooper's eyes never left the bar's entrance as he replied, "And you never will again. Some things aren't meant for mass production." There was something in his tone that suggested entire classified projects had died trying to replicate what he'd just demonstrated. Inside the rusty nail, Daryl's world was collapsing around him. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from Mike and Pete, both already miles away and putting more distance between themselves and Millbrook with every passing minute. The envelope of cash he'd given Jensen lay unopened on a back table, a monument to failed ambition. Sarah Chen had reopened her diner, understanding instinctively that the town needed a return to normalcy, a place to process what they'd just witnessed. Jack Wilson sat at the counter, still on the phone with his military contact. "No, I can't describe the weapon exactly," he was saying. "It moved too fast. But the effects... Someone needs to update those classified files." Cooper finally turned away from the rusty nail, his movement drawing every eye in the vicinity. He walked to the diner with the same measured pace he'd shown all along, as if the afternoon's excitement had been nothing more than a minor interruption to his regular routine. The bell chimed as he entered, and Sarah already had a coffee cup waiting. "Quite a show," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Cooper's small smile actually reached his eyes this time. "Just clearing the air. Town this size doesn't need people like Jensen stirring up trouble." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "Or people who hire them." Tom Henderson, who'd watched everything from his usual booth, spoke up. "Those shots you made, threading the bullet between his fingers, hitting just the gun, that's not just practice. That's something else entirely." Cooper sipped his coffee before responding. "Sometimes the best way to end a fight is to show your opponent that fighting is pointless." Outside, Martinez was coordinating with his deputies, gathering statements and trying to figure out how to write a report about what had happened without sounding insane. His FBI contact had stopped asking questions and started issuing warnings. Whatever they'd just witnessed was beyond any normal classification level. The afternoon light softened toward evening, and Millbrook seemed to breathe again. But everyone knew there was one piece of business still unfinished. Daryl Tucker remained in the rusty nail, his empire of small-town intimidation crumbling around him. Cooper's coffee cup clinked gently against its saucer as he set it down. "Time to finish this," he said quietly, standing. Sarah caught his arm, surprising herself with her boldness. "He's not worth it," she said. "Not after what we just saw." Cooper's expression softened slightly. "Some lessons need to be learned up close and personal. Don't worry, he'll walk away. Might even be a better man for it." As Cooper walked toward the rusty nail, the townsfolk who had gathered to witness the afternoon's events cleared a path. They'd seen what he could do against a trained killer like Jensen. Now they would see how he handled a small-town bully who'd reached too far and learned too late that some legends are better left unchallenged. Jack Wilson's military contact had one final thing to say before hanging up. "Whatever happens next, remember, Cooper doesn't just eliminate threats. He prevents them from ever happening again." The words hung in the air like smoke as Cooper reached for the rusty nail's door, the evening sun catching the silver in his hair and casting his shadow long across the threshold of Daryl Tucker's last stand. The rusty nail's door swung open with barely a creak, the kind of silence that seemed more ominous than any dramatic entrance could have been. Cooper stepped inside, his movement still carrying that same measured precision that had marked everything he did. The bar's interior was dim after the bright afternoon sun, but everyone knew he could see perfectly well in any light. Daryl Tucker stood behind the bar, his usual bravado stripped away like old paint under harsh weather. His hand rested near the shotgun he kept under the counter, a fact Cooper had undoubtedly known about since his first day in town. The few remaining patrons quickly found reasons to leave, filing past Cooper with careful steps and averted eyes. "That gun under the counter," Cooper said softly, his voice carrying in the now empty bar. "Remington 870, modified with an extended tube. You've fired it twice in the last month, both times to intimidate people who couldn't fight back." He moved to the bar, each step precisely placed. "Want to know how I know that?" Daryl's hand trembled near the shotgun. Outside, Sheriff Martinez positioned deputies to keep curious onlookers at a safe distance. Through the window, Sarah Chen watched from her diner, understanding she was about to witness the end of an era in Millbrook. 20 years, Cooper continued, now standing at the bar. 20 years you've been the big fish in this small pond, pushing people around, taking what you want, making others feel small so you could feel big. His gray eyes locked onto Daryl's. "Want to know what I saw when I first walked into town? I saw fear. Not respect. Fear. There's a difference. You don't know anything about this town," Daryl managed, his voice cracking slightly. "About me." Cooper's smile was cold as mountain snow. "I know everything about you, Daryl. Your failed real estate business, the loans you can't repay, the way you've been squeezing local businesses for protection money to keep yourself afloat. Even that incident with Tom Henderson's arm, the one everyone knows about, but nobody could prove." Each word landed like a physical blow, stripping away layers of Daryl's carefully constructed image. His hand inched closer to the shotgun. Cooper noticed, of course. He noticed everything. "Here's what's going to happen," Cooper said, his voice still conversational. "You're going to leave that shotgun where it is. Then you're going to take out your phone and call every person you've been extorting. You're going to apologize, promise to repay what you've taken, and explain that your protection services are permanently discontinued." Daryl's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "Or what? You'll do to me what you did to Jensen?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Cooper's response was almost gentle. "No, Daryl. What I did to Jensen was a demonstration. What I'd do to you would be an ending." Outside, Jack Wilson was explaining to the gathered crowd what his military contact had told him about Cooper's past. The competition shooting, the perfect scores, that wasn't showing off. That was him holding back, practicing fine control. What he did today, threading those shots with surgical precision, that's what he's really capable of. In the bar, Daryl's hand finally moved away from the shotgun. Something in Cooper's eyes, something in the way he stood there so perfectly still, had finally broken through decades of bullying behavior. This wasn't a challenge he could bluster his way through or intimidate into submission. "Your phone, Daryl," Cooper prompted softly. "Those calls won't make themselves. And when you're done—" He reached into his jacket, producing the envelope of cash that Daryl had given Jensen. "We're going to talk about how you're going to make things right in this town. Because at the end of the day, that's what this was all about, making things right." The next hour in the Rusty Nail became a study in public redemption. One by one, Daryl Tucker made his calls, each conversation more difficult than the last. Cooper sat quietly at the bar, sipping water, his mere presence ensuring that every word was sincere, every promise genuine. Outside, the town gathered to witness the dismantling of a decades-long reign of intimidation. "Never seen anything like it," Tom Henderson whispered to Sarah Chen, who had brought coffee to the growing crowd. "He's not just forcing Daryl to make things right. He's making him understand why he has to." Sarah watched through the window as Daryl's face grew more drawn with each call. Years of swagger and intimidation crumbling under the weight of forced accountability. Sheriff Martinez stood nearby, talking quietly with his FBI contact. "You're sure about this approach?" he asked into the phone. The response was clear enough for others to hear. "Cooper's methods have a history of being permanently effective. The psychological impact often lasts longer than physical intervention." Inside, Darrell had reached his final call, to Tom Henderson himself. His voice shook as he apologized for the incident that had left Tom's arm in a sling. "The medical bills," Cooper prompted softly, and Darrell nodded, adding his commitment to cover all expenses related to the injury. Jack Wilson's military contact was still feeding him information, each revelation adding new layers to Cooper's legend. The 94 operation wasn't just about elimination, Jack explained to the gathered crowd. It was about changing behavior patterns in the entire region. They say after he left, criminal activity dropped by 80%. Nobody wanted to risk drawing his attention again. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Millbrook's main street, Cooper finally stood. Darrell remained seated, looking somehow smaller, as if the act of confronting his own behavior had physically deflated him. "Your wallet," Cooper said quietly, and Darrell handed it over without protest. Cooper removed several bank cards and business cards, laying them on the bar. "Starting tomorrow, you're going to visit each bank, each property you've got hidden interests in. You're going to liquidate everything needed to make full restitution." His voice remained conversational, but carried undertones of steel. "I'll be watching. Not just tomorrow or next week, but for as long as it takes." Outside, Sarah noticed something in the gathering dusk. A group of vehicles approaching from the direction of Portland. Jack's phone buzzed with a message. "FBI," he announced to the crowd. Finally got clearance to officially acknowledge Cooper's presence. They want to debrief him about the prototype weapon. Cooper must have heard the approaching vehicles, but he showed no reaction. His focus remained entirely on Darrell. "You're not a bad man at the core," he said, surprising everyone who could hear. "You just forgot how to be a good one. That changes today." The federal vehicles were drawing closer, their headlights cutting through the evening mist. Sarah felt a moment of panic. Would they try to take Cooper into custody? Would there be more violence? But when she looked back through the window, she saw something that made her pause. Cooper was smiling, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "Right on time," he murmured, just loud enough to carry. To Darrell, he added, "The agents who are about to walk through that door, they're going to take official statements about your past activities. You're going to tell them everything, hold nothing back. Consider it your first step toward actual redemption." Martinez's phone buzzed with a final message from his FBI contact. Cooper orchestrated all of this. The timing, the witnesses, even our arrival. He's not just cleaning up the town. He's ensuring the changes stick. This is what he does. This is why they could never replicate his methods. It was never just about the shooting. The FBI agents entered the Rusty Nail with practiced efficiency, their movements precise but unhurried. The lead agent, a tall woman with steel-gray hair, nodded to Cooper as if they were old acquaintances. "Been a while," she said simply. Cooper's slight smile suggested volumes of shared history. "Hello, Diana, right on schedule." Sarah Chen, watching from her position near the door, noticed how the other agents maintained a respectful distance from Cooper, their body language showing a deference that went beyond professional courtesy. These were people who knew exactly what he was capable of, who had perhaps seen the classified footage that Jack's contact had mentioned. "The prototype?" Agent Diana asked, her eyes scanning the room. Cooper shrugged slightly. "Secured and staying that way." Something passed between them, an understanding born of long association. She nodded once, then turned her attention to Darrell Tucker, who seemed to shrink further under her scrutiny. Outside, the town had gathered in force, drawn by the arrival of federal agents and the promise of witnessing the final act of this extraordinary day. Sheriff Martinez moved through the crowd, maintaining order while simultaneously documenting everything for what would surely be the most interesting report of his career. "They're not here for him," Jack Wilson explained to the gathered onlookers, his military contact still feeding him information. They're here because of him, making sure everything's officially recorded, witnessed, and filed. When Cooper changes a place, he makes sure it stays changed. Inside, Daryl was giving his statement, each confession seeming to lift a weight from his shoulders while simultaneously adding to the document Agent Diana was carefully composing on her laptop. Cooper stood by the window, watching the street with his characteristic attention to detail, though everyone knew he was listening to every word. "Tell me something," Sarah said softly, having found the courage to approach him. "Did you choose Millbrook randomly, or did you know about Daryl before you arrived?" Cooper's gray eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something close to warmth in them. "Towns like this," he replied, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "They're like wounds on the landscape. Some heal naturally, some fester. I look for the ones that need help making the right choice." He paused, watching Daryl's ongoing confession. "Sometimes all it takes is showing people a clear example of their potential futures." Tom Henderson had joined them by the window, his injured arm a testament to the old Millbrook that was dying with each of Daryl's admissions. "The shooting contest you mentioned?" he said hesitantly. "The one where you gave competitors a 3-second handicap and that wasn't showing off, was it?" Cooper's smile held a hint of remembered satisfaction. "It was practice," he confirmed. "Learning perfect control, absolute precision. Because sometimes the hardest thing isn't hitting the target, it's choosing exactly how and where to hit it to achieve the right effect." The evening had fully settled over Millbrook now, the streetlights casting pools of yellow illumination on the gathered crowd. Agent Diana's typing had slowed, suggesting Daryl's confession was nearing its end. The other agents maintained their positions, professional, yet still deferential to Cooper's presence. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, gesturing to the transformed scene before them. "To Daryl. To Millbrook." Cooper's expression turned thoughtful as he watched the town he had so dramatically altered in just a few days. "Daryl's going to spend the next few years making amends," he said quietly. "Not because I'm forcing him to, but because he finally understands why he needs to. The FBI will monitor his progress, ensure compliance." He turned to face her fully. "As for Millbrook, sometimes the best medicine for a sick community is a strong dose of truth. The truth about consequences, about choices, about who we really are versus who we could be." 3 days later, Millbrook was already feeling the effects of change. The morning crowd at the Pine Grove Diner had a different energy, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Sarah Chen watched her customers chat freely, noticed how people who'd previously kept to themselves now engaged in easy conversation. The shadow that had hung over the town had lifted, taking with it decades of accumulated fear and resentment. Cooper sat at his usual spot at the counter, the same seat where everything had started. His coffee cup steamed in the early morning light, his presence now a comfort rather than a mystery. The prototype weapon that had so impressed the FBI was nowhere to be seen, though everyone knew he could produce it in an instant if needed. "Daryl's meeting with his first victims today," Sarah mentioned, refilling his cup. "Tom Henderson said he's already received the first payment for his medical bills." Cooper nodded slightly, his eyes tracking movements in the street with habitual vigilance. "Redemption's a journey," he said quietly. "He's taken the first step." Agent Diana had left the previous evening, but not before sharing a revealing conversation with Sheriff Martinez. "Cooper's been doing this for years," she'd explained. "Finding places where corruption has taken root, showing people a better way. Not through violence, though he's certainly capable of it, but through precisely applied pressure at exactly the right points." The story of Jensen's departure had already become local legend, growing with each retelling. How Cooper had demonstrated such impossible speed and accuracy, not to kill, but to teach. How he'd turned Millbrook streets into a lesson that would echo through criminal circles for years to come. "Will you stay?" Sarah asked, the question that had been on everyone's mind. Cooper's small smile carried a hint of genuine warmth. For a while. Changes like this need time to set. And, he paused, looking around the diner with something close to contentment. I've grown fond of your coffee. Jack Wilson burst through the door, waving a newly arrived magazine. You have to see this, he said, spreading it on the counter. It was a competitive shooting publication, featuring an article about the mysterious disappearance of Marcus Lightning Cooper. The photo showed him at his last competition, the government officials watching in the background now clearly identifiable as high-level military personnel. They're declassifying parts of your record, Jack said excitedly. The competition years at least, people should know what's possible, they're saying. Though the later stuff, he glanced at Cooper's calm expression. That's still classified. Outside, Millbrook was coming alive with morning activity. Tom Henderson walked past the window, his arm healing well, nodding respectfully to Cooper through the glass. The Rusty Nail remained closed, its future uncertain, though rumors suggested it might reopen as a family restaurant. Darryl Tucker had been seen cleaning the building himself, a physical manifestation of his fresh start. You know what I can't figure out, Sarah said, leaning on the counter, is whether you're more remarkable for what you can do or for how you choose to use it. Cooper's eyes met hers, and she saw in them not just the calculated precision that had impressed the FBI, but also the wisdom that had transformed their town. The most powerful weapon isn't speed or accuracy, he replied softly. It's showing people who they really are, and who they could be. Sometimes they just need someone to demonstrate the difference clearly enough. The morning sun climbed higher over Millbrook, painting the street in shades of promise. The town had changed, not through violence, but through the precise application of truth and consequence. Cooper sipped his coffee, his quiet presence a reminder that sometimes the most effective force for change isn't the loudest or most dramatic, but the one that knows exactly where and how to apply pressure. In the end, the legend of Marcus Lightning Cooper grew not just from his impossible shots or his classified operations, but from the way he chose to use those skills. In Millbrook, and probably dozens of other towns across America, he'd proved that the deadliest weapon isn't a gun or a prototype, but the ability to make people see themselves clearly, and the wisdom to show them a better way.